Alright, welcome back everyone. Sorry it's been such a long time since my last video. I've had a lot going on, but I am back now and more ready than ever to talk about books. While I've been away, I've definitely been doing a lot of reading, mainly just to escape into another realm. And so I wanted to talk about that, and in particular I wanted to talk about the classics that I've been reading, or more how I read classics and how I get on with classics. Because one thing that I find, or that I used to find with classics, is that they are often very difficult to read, especially when you're talking about really old classics like Jane Austen or Charles Dickens. And a lot of people I talk to are just put off by reading these tomes because they just fall asleep. And if you're like me, I'm someone who just struggles to stay awake when I read anything, no matter how much I'm enjoying it. So these are some tips for people who want to get into classic books, and also maybe just more generic tips if you struggle like me to stay awake while you're reading. The first thing I would say if you want to get into classics, especially if we're talking the stuffy old stuff, I think the best thing that you can do is listen to an audiobook instead of reading the text in your head on the page. This to me has been an absolute godsend, and it's allowed me to engage with books that otherwise I would have just fallen asleep through. I think Dickens is a really good example of this because although I do like Dickens a lot, I do struggle to read his prose. So when I listen to it in audiobook, which I have done before, I've talked a lot on this channel already about Miriam Margolyes's recordings of Bleak House. I just think that they're fantastic. And the great thing about classics is when you get an audio recording, it's usually a really respected actor doing the recordings, because obviously they want to do the recordings of these great books. So that's a big bonus as well. Not only do you take some of the work off yourself, because you don't have to create voices for the characters, and you don't have to deal with the stilted prose and kind of work out what's going on. All that stuff is sent off to the voice actor. They do that work, and that means you can just focus on enjoying the story that's being told to you and imagining the world and all that kind of stuff. So I think that is a really good way to engage with a story. This year I'm trying to read all of Jane Austen's novels, and as well as reading them, I'm listening to audio recordings as well. I'm really enjoying at the minute Rosamund Pike's versions of Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. I think she doesn't do any of the other ones. I hope she does at some point, but she's only done these two so far, and I just think they're astounding. Although I really have a lot to say about her work on The Wheel of Time, I'll definitely give her credit for her work with Austen's books, because she just does a great job of bringing these stories to life. Now, some people will say that using an audiobook is somehow cheating, and that you're not really reading the classics if you're listening to the audiobook. There are a few arguments for this. One of them is that you don't spend enough time listening to it because you get distracted. Well, I have that issue when I just read text, so it's not like just because you're listening to the audiobook you'll get distracted. Now some people are like that, some people don't listen to audiobooks for that reason, but if you struggle with just sitting down and reading a book, then an audiobook is not, it's worth giving it a try, because you might find that you're just a little bit better when you're listening to it rather than reading it. Another thing that people say is that you're sort of cheating if you listen to an audiobook because you're listening to an interpretation of the text. And while that is true, you are getting an interpretation because the actor who's reading the story will, put in their own voices and interpretation on the characters. That doesn't mean that you don't imagine anything. My imagination is still firing and going all over the place when I am listening to a story. And so I don't really think that's I don't think that's really a good reason to say that audiobooks don't count. It's certainly slightly different from reading it, but I would say that they're equally valid, and both have their advantages and disadvantages. The second thing that I would say though is don't be tempted to listen to audiobooks, especially with classics on double speed. One thing that's worth reading classics for is that they make you think, they make you connect with people from a different time and a different world. And if you're speeding your way through it, you're going to miss things, and you're not going to take that time to reflect and think about what you're reading. I used to listen to books on double speed quite a lot, and I've actually stopped doing this now. I just don't do it. I listen to audiobooks on one speed. And the reason why I do this is because I've realised that I just actually want to enjoy the story, and I don't feel the need to have this big race to the finish. So yeah, it takes me a bit longer to finish these books, but I think I actually am able to appreciate them a bit more. So yeah, I would definitely avoid using that whole double speed thing. It's not about getting to that finishing point. It's just about sitting back, enjoying the story, and being there for the ride. Also, if you've got a great character, actor doing these characters, you want to enjoy their voices, and it does kind of get lost in the mix if you're listening to them speak at double speed. So I would recommend just taking your time, listening to it on a nice regular pace, and going with it that way. The second thing is similar to audiobooks, but if you can't afford audiobooks because either they're very expensive if you buy them on your own, or you don't want to buy like an Audible subscription, which is what I have, You could just read the books aloud yourself, which, I've been doing myself this month, and again, it's been really great. I've been doing this specifically with Dickens novels, and at the moment my intention is to kind of do this with all of his novels. I don't know if I will ever realise that ambition. I started doing this at the beginning of April, and I'm still not even finished with volume 1 of the Pickwick Papers. So it's a much slower way of reading, because obviously it's your voice, and so you can't really... you can put it on double speed if you can read fast, but I certainly can't read Dickens that fast. So it is certainly a slow way of reading, but again, it's a really rewarding one, partly because it forces you to go a bit slower, and you have to say every word, so again, it's less likely that you're going to get distracted. I also think that for me personally, again, as someone who is quite prone to falling asleep while I'm reading, especially when I'm reading older texts, this helps keep me awake because I struggle to, fall asleep and nod off when I'm having to read the text aloud, think about character voices, and get really into the story. So if you have that problem, try reading things out loud. Another good reason, I think, for reading books aloud is that, at the end of the day, some authors do write stories that are sort of meant to be performed, and Dickens is a great example of this. He performed his stories out loud all the time, his characters are very theatrical, and I actually find that his very long-winded sentences with all of the commas and clauses and all of this stuff, they really do come to life when you say them out loud. When I'm reading them in my head, it's just like a big long list and I just want to get to the end of it. But when I'm reading it out loud and I'm thinking about the character, I'm just able to bring these sentences to life, just like I hear, voice actors bring them to life. I'm not saying I'm anywhere near as good at bringing the characters to life as those people, but still, it really forces you to engage with the text in a different kind of way than you do when you're just listening in your head. I've also found that with the Pickwick Papers, I really do remember most of the story, whereas when I read in my head, I do get distracted, and even with an audiobook I can get distracted. But when I'm reading out loud, that doesn't happen very often. Sometimes, even then, you can go and sort of autopilot a bit, but in general, I really do pay attention to the story a lot more, and it just, it sticks in the mind, which is great for me, because obviously I end up reviewing these books, so it's quite good to be able to remember what actually happened in them. Another thing that you could do that's similar to this is not just to read the book aloud on your own, but to read it with people. When I was much younger, I did this with my younger brother and sister. They're 10 years younger than me, and I wanted to get them into A Series of Unfortunate Events by Lemony Snicket. So what I did was, I said, well, I'll read the stories to you, but you two can read Klaus and Violet. So they took one each of the three main characters. And so they read the speech for those characters, and I did the other characters' voices, and we'd swap with the narration. And this was really fun, and we really enjoyed it, and it's something that, even now we still talk about and remember it. And it was a really fun way to engage with the text, because it made something that was quite a solitary thing more communal, which I really enjoyed. So that's another way that I would recommend engaging with the text in this kind of way. So the third thing is something that I haven't really done since I was in college, which is when I dropped English, but I decided to try this technique again with reading, and that is to interact with the text by making notes on the text and reflecting on it, and even writing, in some cases, like mini sort of diary entries on the text that I'm writing. So when I moved down to where I am now, one morning I decided to go into town. It was a really sunny day. I went to a bookshop, bought some new books, then got a coffee and just read a chapter of this slim book that I got, and then just kind of thought about it for a bit, and then wrote some notes on it. And I've been doing this sporadically with some other books as well at the minute. Every time I kind of finish reading, I'll just jot down some thoughts on what I've read. And I found, again, this is a really good way to keep me awake while I'm reading, but it also helps me and forces me to reflect on the text and to think about it, which again, if you're going to read classics, I think that's really where the value lies. There isn't much value in just getting to the end of, say, Pride and Prejudice or Bleak House, but not remembering any of it and not really understanding what on earth it was about. The value of the text comes from just sitting down and thinking about it. And so this technique I found really useful. So this is something else that I would recommend. Don't just, read the text as quickly as possible, but when something kind of comes up in the book, whether that's a quote or like an idea that you find interesting, or you notice a connecting theme or a technique, just underline that bit of text and make a note of it. Or when you've finished reading, say, a couple of chapters, just write down your reflections on what's happened. I found that with Dickens, for example, this has really helped me appreciate the way that he builds tension throughout the serialized format that he's working within. One thing that I noticed with the Pickwick Papers, for example, is the way that he will kind of begin with an inciting incident, there's some kind of resolution, but then within that he'll like set up little plot points that are going to be picked up in later serials, and then in the third serial there'll be some kind of resolution, but then also some new problem that keeps the story propelling forward. And I just don't think I would have noticed these small little things in Dickens' work if I was just reading it and not really making notes and not really interacting with it. So again, I think that's a really good way of getting over that difficulty with a text. Instead of just seeing it as a passive activity where you just sit there and stare at words, do things that really make you engage with the text. And a really good way to do that is to make notes, write down your thoughts on what's going on, write down your thoughts on what you think might go on in future chapters. All this kind of stuff just helps you really get involved in the text. So I think that would be another really good way of engaging with older works that can sometimes be a little bit difficult to just sit there and read. And the final and fourth thing that I would suggest, it's not to do with reading classics themselves, but instead it's to do with background information and context. One thing that I have never done until very recently with my Jane Austen reads is actually to read a biography of the author while I'm reading the author's works. So I'd already read Sense and Sensibility and most of Pride and Prejudice when I decided that I would read a biography of Jane Austen. I think it's the one that's called Jane Austen, A Life. I can't remember the author. This was a really good idea because it helped me put Austen's work into a little bit of context. When you can understand the author and the time period and their problems and their life essentially, it just helps you put what they're doing into context. So for example, Jane Austen was someone who was born into the lower ranks of the kind of gentry, if you like, and so money was always a bit of an issue in her kind of social group. She lived in a precarious financial situation. She wasn't like, destitute and poor on the streets or anything, but money was always a kind of concern within her family because they had an unstable position. And so then you see money as a theme always coming up in Jane Austen's books. Take Marianne and Eleanor in Sense and Sensibility. The whole inciting incident of the story is that their father dies, and now because of stupid wills they don't have any money and they have to sort of make their own way, usually through marriage. And you really appreciate that once you have an understanding of Austen's life, or at least I did. I really saw why she would care so much about this particular kind of thing, because it was something that was involved in her own life. And so I think that is another way to really engage with the text, because sometimes when you're reading an old text, things can just seem very alien. You're learning about this world, especially if it's hundreds of years ago, and you're thinking to yourself, why do the characters think in this way? Why do they care about these things? I can't relate to them at all. Well, a good way to try and relate to them is to try and relate to the author. And once you can understand the author and where they're coming from, not only does that help you understand the text that they've written in terms of the characters and relating to them, but it also helps you understand their just whole body of work and what they were trying to do. So this is something that I would definitely recommend, and something that I'm probably going to start doing now myself. So whenever I'm getting into a reading session where I want to read multiple books by a writer, so Dickens will probably be the next one that I do this for, I'm going to read a biography of them as well, or an autobiography if there's one about, so that I can really get into the mind of the writer and get into the world that they've created. And again, what that means that when I actually go read the text, there'll just be things that I'm capable of noticing a lot more. One thing that I hear a lot, and one thing that I've struggled with in the past, is just not getting what's going on. And a really good way to overcome that is just to do a little bit of history on the writer, on the time period, and then you can take all of that knowledge and apply it to the story, and suddenly it just comes to life even more. So that's my final tip for trying to understand classics. Alright, that's it for this video. Let me know down in the comments if you have any tips and tricks of your own for trying to get into classics. Also let me know if you have any of your own kind of struggles with reading classics. Are you like me and do you just fall asleep a lot while you're reading? And do you employ any of these techniques in order to try and stay awake and try and understand these old texts? I will be uploading a second video this week to make up for the many weeks that I have missed, and that video will be the start of a new series on the channel that I'm really looking forward to getting into, because I feel like it's about time I committed a bit more with this channel and also maybe tried some new things. Don't worry though, the topic of conversation will always be more or less on the written word. So we're not changing things too much, but just a little bit. But that's it for now. Take care everyone. Ta-ra!